Hi students, welcome to our study of the Civil War. When we think about a civil war, we know what war is, but what makes it a civil war? Let's talk about what the meaning of civil is and see if we can figure it out. Here on the screen you have some definitions for the word civil. Take a moment, glance down through those, see which one might apply. Do you think it might mean courteous and polite? Is it a courteous and polite war? No, no war is courteous and polite. The definition we use when we think of the word civil war is occurring between citizens of the same country. A civil war happens when a country goes to war with itself. War is always terrible. War is always tragic. Civil wars are especially tragic because no other countries are involved. No outside forces are involved. It's literally a country fighting against and within itself. So I want to know, what do you already know about the Civil War? I'm going to ask you to pause the video here and talk about it. What are the things you already know? All right, welcome back. So maybe you said that you already know that it was the North versus the South. Or maybe you already know that it was about slavery. Or maybe you know that Abraham Lincoln was the president during the Civil War. Those are all great things to know and a good baseline for where we're going in our study. Here we have a map of the United States from that time. So take a moment and look at it. We see that we have these countries down in the southern part of our country. They actually withdrew from the United States and formed their own country called the Confederate States of America. The United States of America was represented by the countries in the dark blue up there. All of the countries down here were slave-holding states, and they decided with the election of Abraham Lincoln that they didn't want to be part of the United States anymore because they were threatening to make slavery illegal. The countries that you see in light blue right here, those were also slave-holding states, but they did not secede from the United States. They stayed in the Union, as we call it. We call those the border states. And then these blue states up here are what were at the time the United States of America. I want you to think about what it might feel like to go to war with your own countrymen, sometimes brother fighting brother. Take a moment and pause and have a discussion about what that might have been like. Welcome back, everybody. Now we're going to move into talking about how many people died in the Civil War. We're going to do that by comparing other wars that the United States has been in. Let's start with the Revolutionary War, which, we studied not that long ago. The Revolutionary War, 0.9% of the population died, but I want you to realize again, there were only 13 colonies, then becoming 13 states. That's a pretty significant portion of that little amount of population. But the death totals were only 25,000. Still a lot, still tragic. But when we compare it to the Korean War, you see we just went up by over 10,000 deaths. Vietnam, 11 deaths per day for the war in Vietnam. World War I, now we're getting into the hundreds of thousands of people who died, and that's 0.11% of the population at the time. Because then we have all of our 50 states, so the population is greater, but still, that's quite a number of people. How about World War II? In World War II, we had 405,399 deaths. That's 416 deaths a day, which was 0.31% of the population. How does that compare with the Civil War? The Civil War deaths total were 625,000. If you look at all of those other wars, the Civil War is greater than all the other wars that we fought in combined. There were 599 deaths per day in the Civil War, and that totaled 2% of the population. Some Civil War battles had 30% casualties. That means 30% of the people who fought in those battles died in those battles. There was a battle called the Battle of Cold Harbor where 7,000 men died in 20 minutes. It was a bloody and brutal event. I want you to think about that 2% of the population. You may think, oh, it doesn't sound like very much. 2% of the population now would be 6,280,000. Imagine if we were in a conflict and 6 million of our fellow countrymen died. That was what happened in the Civil War. Almost every family was touched. Almost every family lost someone during those 4 years. Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time of the Civil War. I'm quite a fan of Abraham Lincoln. He's not a perfect man, but I do believe that he was the man to lead our country through that terrible time. He came from the most humble of beginnings. He was really poor, born in a log cabin. He had barely a year total of formal education, and yet he rose to lead the nation through our most difficult time. What were some of the issues that Lincoln faced? Well, the country was tearing itself apart over slavery, literally tearing itself apart. He was constantly mocked and ridiculed for his country ways. He couldn't find a general who could fight until quite late in the war. And while he was in the White House, he and his wife actually lost one of their children. Some of the positives: Lincoln actually hired his rivals, the people who ran against him. He hired them to serve in his cabinet. That's virtually unheard of in any presidency before or definitely since. Now, you would never consider, if you had a Democratic president hiring a Republican, or if you had a Republican president hiring a Democrat, it wouldn't happen. But he did that. He wanted to hear from all of the sides. He was a very eloquent speaker. We are going to be memorizing one of his most famous speeches. He was very compassionate, empathetic, and most of all, Abraham Lincoln was unafraid to do what was right, even if it was incredibly unpopular. I'm showing you this picture. This is what he looked like when he was running for president. He's not a handsome man, and he often joked about the fact that he was not the most handsome man you've ever seen. This is what he looked like when he was running for president. This is what he looked like 3 years later. Look at the aging on that face in just 3 years. You can see that the Civil War and what's happening in our country is really weighing heavy on him and ripping at his heart and making him age extraordinarily quickly. But I want you to really take a look at this next picture. This picture was taken in 1865, right after the end of the Civil War and just a little bit before his death. He's 56 in that photo. Only 5 years have passed between those two photos. For reference, I'm 55. So that is a lot of aging, a lot of stress, a lot of weariness on his soul that happened during that time. On April 14th, 1865, in Ford's Theater, which you can still go to in Washington, D.C., he and his wife sat right there in that box watching a play when a man named John Wilkes Booth snuck into the back and shot and murdered Abraham Lincoln. Before the Civil War, the states almost considered themselves separate countries. It was proper English back then to say the United States are. States is plural, so it made sense to say the United States are doing this because the states actually thought of themselves as individual places. After the Civil War, it became proper to say the United States is. I think the Civil War joined us even more than the Revolutionary War did. It solidified who we are as a country. Oh, and here's me and Link, just posing for a selfie. Welcome to our study of the Civil War.